Today I have with me the president of the Democratic Labour Party, Ms. Verla De Peiza. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, as usual, Kobie, for having me.
Today we are going to be discussing the Barbados Optional Savings Scheme. You would have released a press statement on Friday and you would have asked a couple of questions. Give us your thoughts on this BOSS program.
Okay. The program that is being offered, because right now it is only at the offer stage, it sounds really good, but it has a lot of issues that we need to get the answers to them before we can decide whether or not it really is as good as it sounds. And that is really the problem with acronyms. They give you a certain feel, but they don't necessarily delve into the waters deep enough to let you know whether or not you actually are getting a good and sound bargain. Why that is important is because we are dealing with wages, which according to the Constitution and the Protection of Wages Act are supposed to be sacrosanct. You're not supposed to tamper with them. That, of course, came out of a very analogous situation back in the 1990s when the government of the day was also facing a crisis and sought to cut public sector wages as a means of creating fiscal space for the government to be able to carry on its program. It was, I don't want to say it was soundly defeated, but it was very much defeated. They marched up and down the country. I remember there was a referendum, and one of the features of the referendum that was defeated, one of the options was that you would take part of the part of your pay that was hived off, that you would take it in bonds so that it would accrue interest over time and be repaid in the future. And that was rejected by the credit unions and rejected by the public workers. Now, we are having the precise option again, and it is being received differently. But why I am viewing this differently is because in the first instance, it was a straightforward bond issue, whereas here we're having more of an accounting nightmare. As far as I am concerned, I'm seeing other layers of red tape, and that is not just blowing hot air. I'm thinking about the temporary workers and the struggle that they get to be paid now. I'm thinking about the nurses in particular who have spoken out about an issue that they have had going back literally decades in getting their names on the system so that they can get paid. And I am wondering if we are not creating yet another layer of red tape, this time not for a section of the public service, but for the entire public service to whom these bonds would apply. And I'm also wondering, what are the conditionalities? I mean, we hear that they're going to be tradable, but are they tradable at value? Or are they going to be tradable on whatever it is the market deems them to be worth? In which case, people need to know that upfront, whether or not they may be facing a loss if the market doesn't have the taste for them with the same excitement that they're being pitched. And I think it is also necessary because the way in which they are being introduced with an opt-out clause still creates a pay cut, because the default position is to get less money in your hands. Deferred expense, I beg your pardon, deferred earnings means that you have less in your hand to meet your own expense. So whilst we may be looking to address the economy and turnover in the economy in one respect, we're also dampening the ability to spend in the other respect. So we have to be very careful how it is we are doing this juggling act. And all of those details, I think, need to be discussed upfront before we can make any determination that this really is as fantastic as it is being sold.
Just to ask a question there, the opposition, the PDP, would have stated in a statement that it is illegal. And then we also have some economists and some social commentators who've stated that It is being touted as an optional scheme, but it really isn't optional. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So that's why I started with the framework of the Constitution and the legislation. The legislation does say that you have to be paid in legal tender, but the legislation does also make room for an agreement between the employer and the employee. So I'm just watching that space carefully before I make any profound statement on its legality. But absolutely, the way in which it is being pitched, it is a pay cut. And on that basis alone, there could be a call stating that it is illegal under the legislation that we have. The other caveat that I have, besides agreement, is that we have a government that has the ability to make whatever change in legislation and constitution that it likes. And we have seen that they're not shy about doing it. They don't even tell you sometimes when they're doing it. You just have to be paying careful attention to take note when certain things are happening. And I don't make that as an idle thought. I am very concerned about the executive powers that were given to the Prime Minister. I raised the alarm in relation to the significant changes to our criminal law at a time when our focus was somewhere else. It wasn't even divided. It was 100% somewhere else. We were supposedly discussing something completely different and an emergency situation. And then within that discussion, immediately after, hopefully the whole of Barbados was not taking note, something else was done that made radical change to the way that Barbadians understand their rights. So I hold those two caveats. One, that employers and employees can make agreements for particular things. And two, that the government of the day has the ability to make sweeping and substantial changes without having to apply to anyone else, except in the Senate. They will need a couple more votes to make a constitutional change outside of the numbers that they have on their side. But that is the only stopgap that they have against doing what they feel like in Parliament. So we have to be mindful of these things. We can speak to the illegality, but we have to know that it can change. What I will say is that I do not think that they can sidestep legislation via collective agreement. They will have to have that individual agreement coming from each worker. And it sounds as though the plan is intending to have that built in. But then again, it hasn't said how. Can I get up the morning of payday and decide, look, I want my money and not these bonds? Or do I have to know in advance that I'm going to need this money and give you 2 or 3 weeks notice so that we don't get tied up in Smart Stream or whatever program it is that they are using? So we have all of these practicalities to work out. The fluff is there. It is very cushy and comfortable sounding, but we need to really be knocking to see if there's any substance to that wood, or if the wood acts have eaten it out completely.
And what I would ask as well, too, the Prime Minister is set to meet with the unions and the workers this week as well. And the question was asked at the press conference, do you think that there will be significant buying given all of the economic challenges that we would have seen so far with many people being unemployed, the economic situation? Do you think that if the kinks are worked out, that this could be an attractive scheme to workers in Barbados?
I don't know, because we have recent history where government paper was devalued. I want to say on a whim, but there was a vote taken. We were never given any audited results of the vote. We were just told it was overwhelmingly subscribed to, but there was no independent verification of those results. So we're in a circumstance where we can have that mirrored again, and we are told that there is overwhelming subscription, when really and truly we don't have a way of verifying whether or not that is the case. So the meetings are fine so long as they're giving substance and not just regurgitating what we have heard already, because a lot of the queries, not just ours, but others as well, are genuine. They're very genuine concerns. So having had that experience very, very recently of the devaluation of government paper, there may not be the taste for it in the public service to pick it up. And I will carry that through to its logical conclusion. Banks and financial institutions also were hit hard by the domestic debt restructuring of government paper. Will they still have taste for it? We hear that they're tradable, but I haven't heard any of the private sector coming out and saying they are willing to trade them at value, trade them at a premium, they trade them at discount. We have not heard. There has been radio silence from the financial community as to whether or not they too have bought in, which I think would add to any confidence level that the public service would have in subscribing to the bonds.
And you mentioned earlier in the interview that government has an accounting crisis, and noted that for the debt restructuring. But I also want to ask you about the BERT program now, in which you mentioned in your release on Friday, in which you basically said that it is now dead in the water. So what are your thoughts now on how does this BOSS program complement the BERT and the IMF targets that we also have to meet?
I don't know that they're complementary. The BERT program did have built into it a component for capital works. Now, it is pretty clear now that we're coming and we're speaking about capital works twice again in the stimulus package, where quite frankly, the majority of the capital works in that stimulus package was moving from the private sector, and there were projects that already were on stream. There's not a new project that was named in the stimulus package earlier this month. So we have the same programs being touted in relation to the funds that are raised by these bonds, which suggests that BERT has been shelved in some way, shape, or form. It also makes me very keen to hear the outcome of the meeting on the 3rd of June with the IMF, because we know that some space was given and we have moved from trying to achieve a surplus of 6% to achieving a surplus of 1%. But the international communities, and quite frankly, even the IMF, have put out statements that suggest that countries' priorities have shifted towards more or less a survival mode, as opposed to anything else right now. And that is why the Democratic Labour Party claims that it is the time to bring BERT back to the table and renegotiate it is now, because the international climate is facing in that direction. We have had a medical team that worked so hard, and despite our borders not closing on time, despite persons still coming in, they have managed to contain the virus. But our major trading partners have not been so lucky. So we face a circumstance where, whilst we were, perhaps because we are smaller, so we were able to rein it in better. Plus, of course, we had certain provisions in place already. The Best Dos Santos lab on site under the last administration, the Blackman and Gollop School, which was built to deal with crises, could be pressed into service. It was meant for hurricanes, but it could be pressed into service in relation to this emergency. So we had certain things in place. Turns out we didn't need as many ventilators as we thought we would. And perhaps we need to be mindful of those monies and how we redirect them, if we have it in cash and if we have them in ventilators, and whether or not there is some onward sale that we can have, similar to what the Cayman Islands did for us with their onward sale of their testing kits. So we are at a position internationally where debt is no longer the ultimate focus, and the survival of a country has become top priority. So the Democratic Labour Party holds the view that now is the time to be renegotiating with the IMF in some, not just on that one point in relation to the moving of the surplus, the target that we're looking to meet, but that we should have all of the parameters redressed. That does not mean that they will all change, but let's put all the cards on the table again and start from scratch, because COVID has introduced a brand new consideration to the entire world that has just simply changed its focus in a 3-month period.
And finally, I'll ask you, in relation to what are some of the other solutions that you would, or the Democratic Labour Party rather, would put forward in this current economic crisis, seeing that a previous administration would have handled a situation like this in 1994, and we would have seen the legislation that you would have touted before, as to how Barbados can reposition itself economically to manage the current situation going forward, as opposed to or to complement or to tweak the BOSS program?
Okay, back in January, before COVID was an issue for Barbados or even much of a talking point around the world, I delivered the Errol Barra Memorial Lecture. And in that, I laid out a framework for policy where, before any of this happened, we were contemplating removing the myopic focus on tourism, which is simply too fickle. It depends on much more than anything we can offer. It depends on just at the basics, how people feel about Barbados in a particular moment, never mind the economic conditions that they meet at home before they come here. And then the types of tourist offerings that we had, and the fact that a lot of our offerings in terms of entertainment and attraction was dated. I don't want to say tired, but dated. And we were concerned that every time we are buffeted, it is tourism that falters. And the knock-on effect is that our entire economy falters. And the Democratic Labour Party is very interested in diversifying the economy and bringing other revenue streams onto the table. We recognize that each will need some element of babysitting. For the first point, is going to be just like raising a child. You know, they go through the toddler years, they have to learn to crawl before they can walk and then start to run. But we thought that it was necessary to be reshaping the focus of Barbados to do something more than tourism, so that the next time, not knowing that the next time you were going to have a shop was 2 months down the road, because remember, this is January in the Errol Barra Memorial Lecture, not knowing that in 2 months' time we were going to be facing the very things that we were talking about at that lecture. So that continues to be the focus of the Democratic Labour Party, that Barbados needs to have something of its own. And alongside that, we need to be more self-sufficient in how we feed ourselves, and that has a knock-on effect in terms of water harvesting and how because you can't have an agricultural industry without being able to water the plants. So there a whole restructuring of the ethos and the focus of Barbados is where the Democratic Labour Party is headed in the future. And that is what we want to have as a major discussion. And part and parcel, and maybe at the core of all of these changes, will be small business and entrepreneurial development, including the cultural industry.
I just want to thank you, Ms. De Peiza, for sharing your thoughts on the Barbados Optional Savings Scheme.
Thank you very much for having me.